The coins in Hannah Whitfield's palm came to $4.35. And she counted them 3 times in the cold cab of her truck, because she could not make herself believe it the first 2. Outside, the snow came down the way it always did in Marrow Lake in late November. Not in storms, just steady and patient, like the sky had decided to bury the whole town 1 flake at a time, and was in no rush about it. The parking lot of the Foodland was half empty. A man was scraping his windshield 2 spots over. Somewhere a plow scraped down Main Street, that long metal groan she'd heard 10,000 times in her life, and never once noticed until this winter, when every ordinary sound seemed to have an edge to it. In the back seat, Eli was singing to himself. He was 6 years old as of 3 days from now, and he had no idea that his mother was sitting in the front seat with $4.35, and a stomach full of the particular dread that only comes when you have already done the math, and the math has already told you no. "You, Mum," he said, "is it the cake store?" "Not yet, Bud." "You said cake." "I said maybe. I said we'd see." He went quiet at that, and the quiet was worse than the question. Eli had learned, somewhere in this hard year, what "we'll see" meant. He was a smart kid. Too smart sometimes for his own good and for hers. He'd learned not to push. He'd learned to fold his hands in his lap and look out the window and wait. And a 6-year-old should not know how to do that, and the fact that he did was a thing Hannah carried around in her chest like a stone she couldn't set down. She put the coins back in the front pocket of her coat, and zipped it. Then she sat there a minute longer, watching the snow land on the hood and melt and land again, and she let herself remember, just for a second, the version of her life where this was not a problem. The version where Mark was still alive. It had been 14 months. People kept telling her it would get easier, and in some ways it had. She could say his name now without her throat closing. She could drive past the mill without the whole afternoon falling apart, but in the ways that counted, the ways that showed up on the 1st of every month, it had only gotten harder. Mark had been 36 when the loader rolled at the yard. He'd done everything right his whole life, and he died doing his job on a Tuesday. And the thing nobody tells you about a thing like that is how long the paperwork takes, and how little is left when the paperwork is done. There'd been a settlement. People assumed there was always a settlement, the way people assume there's always a fund, always insurance, always some invisible net under the family of a man who dies young. And there had been some money, eventually, but Mark had been young, and they had been young together, and young people who are pinching every dollar to make a mortgage in a town where the mill is the only real work. Young people like that do not carry much life insurance, because the premium is one more bill, and you are so sure, that you have time. The settlement had come, and the lawyer had taken his share, and the hospital had taken its share for the 2 days he'd lived after, and the line of credit they'd opened to fix the furnace had taken its share, and what was left had carried her and Eli through the first winter and most of the second, and now it was gone. Just gone. She'd watched the last of it leave the account on a Thursday in October, the way you'd watch the tide go out, knowing it wasn't coming back in any time soon. Dough, $4.35, and a boy in the back seat turning 6. "Okay," she said, more to herself than to him. "Okay, come on, let's go look." The bakery on Main was called Petit Beurre, and it had opened 2 years ago when a couple from down south bought the old hardware building and gutted it and put in big windows and a chalkboard menu and prices that made the older folks in town suck their teeth. It was not, in truth, a place Hannah had ever shopped. It was a place she'd walked past with Eli's hand in hers, slowing down so he could look at the cakes in the window, the way you'd slow down at a pet store knowing full well you weren't bringing anything home. But it was the only real bakery in town, and the Foodland's birthday cakes were $40 under cellophane, and she'd had a thought. A stupid, hopeful, embarrassing thought. That maybe a real bakery would have something small. A cupcake. A single nice thing. That maybe $4 could buy one nice thing, and she could put a candle in it. And her son could have a birthday that didn't come out of a freezer. The bell over the door rang when they went in, and the warm air hit them, and Eli made a small sound in his throat, a kind of involuntary wonder, because the place smelled like butter and sugar and the inside of a good dream. The cases were full, tarts with fruit arranged like jewels. Croissants stacked in golden rows, and the cakes were the kind you saw in magazines, smooth and pale and impossible, with chocolate curls and candied flowers and little gold flecks that caught the light. A woman stood behind the counter. She was maybe 50, with reading glasses on a chain and an apron that had never seen a smudge, and she watched Hannah and Eli come in with an expression Hannah recognized immediately, because she'd been on the receiving end of it more than once. In the last year, It was the look of someone doing arithmetic about you. Taking in the coat that was 2 seasons old, the boy's boots that were a size too big because they were meant to last 2 winters. The way a person carries themselves when they have already decided, before they walk in, that they cannot afford the room they're standing in. "Can I help you?" the woman said. It wasn't really a question. "Hi," Hannah said. "We're just looking. It's my son's birthday's coming up." She put her hand on Eli's shoulder. He was up on his toes at the case, his breath fogging the glass. "I was wondering if you had anything small, a cupcake maybe, something with a candle." The woman's eyes moved to the boy, then back. "The cupcakes are $6 each." $6. Hannah felt the heat climb up her neck. "Oh," she said. "Okay, is there anything?" "Here, the macarons are $3.50. A macaron. 1 macaron. Eli had never had a macaron in his life and would not know it from a cookie, and she could buy one of them, and that was the birthday she could afford at a real bakery. A single small almond cookie split between a mother and her son, and she was, for one terrible second, actually considering it. That was the part she'd think about later, that she'd considered it. "Maman," Eli said. He still said it the way Mark used to. Mark, whose own mother had been Quebecoise, a little thread of the man left living in his son's mouth. "Can I have that one, the blue one?" He was pointing at a cake. Of course he was pointing at the cake. A round one, glossy and pale blue, with a fox on top made out of fondant, a little orange fox curled up asleep, and a tag in front of it that read $42. "That's a cake, bud," she said quietly. That's a special one." "It's a fox." He said it like that settled the matter, like a fox was a reason. And the woman behind the counter, who had been watching all of this, who had done her arithmetic and reached her conclusion, said the thing that Hannah would hear in her head for a long time after. "This isn't a museum," she said. "If he's not going to buy anything, please don't let him breathe on the case. I just cleaned it." It went through Hannah like a wire, not loud. That was the thing. The woman didn't raise her voice. She said it, the way you'd ask someone to wipe their feet, mild and reasonable, and that was what made it land. Because it meant she didn't think she was being cruel. She thought she was being practical. She thought a poor woman and her boy were a thing you cleaned up after. 2 other customers were in the shop. A man at the window table with a laptop, a woman picking out a baguette, and they both did the thing people do, which is look without looking, go still and pretend to read the menu, and Hannah felt every one of them, felt the whole warm bright room turn into a place she was not welcome. "He wasn't touching anything," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. His breath's on the glass. "He's 6. I'm just asking him to step back." Eli had already stepped back. He'd done it the second the woman started talking, the way he'd learned to make himself small, and he had his hand wrapped in the hem of Hannah's coat now, and he was looking up at his mother's face to find out how bad this was, because that was how he gauged the world now, by his mother's face. And Hannah did the thing she had gotten very good at in the last 14 months. She swallowed it. She put her hand on her son's head and she said, "Okay, we're going. Sorry to bother you." And she heard herself apologizing for existing in the room, and she hated it. She hated it so much, and she turned to go. That was when the bell over the door rang again. He came in stamping snow off his boots, an older man, broad through the shoulders, with a gray beard gone white at the chin and a toque pushed back off his forehead and a face that was red from the cold. He was carrying a cardboard tray with a couple of Tim Hortons cups in it, and he had the unhurried way about him of a man who'd lived in a small town his whole life and was never, ever in a rush, because where was there to rush to? Hannah didn't know him. She'd find out his name was Walter Brisson, that he'd run a heating and cooling outfit out on the highway for 30 years before his knees gave out, that he'd buried his wife Denise 4 winters back, and now spent his mornings driving around with coffee for people, because an empty house in the morning is a hard thing. But she didn't know any of that yet. She just knew an old man had come in out of the snow, and was holding the door a second too long, letting the cold in, looking at her. He'd heard it. She could tell from his face that he'd heard the last part of it, at least. He looked at Hannah, and he looked at the boy with his hand twisted in her coat, and he looked at the woman behind the counter. And something moved across his expression. Not anger, exactly. Something older and quieter than anger, a kind of weariness, like he'd seen this particular thing too many times to be surprised by it and had never once made his peace with it. "Cold one out there," he said, to nobody, to everybody. He set his tray of coffees down on the window table and pulled his gloves off finger by finger. Then he turned to Eli and he crouched down, the way old men with bad knees crouch, with a hand on the case to steady himself. And the woman opened her mouth about the glass and then thought better of it. You having a birthday, son? Walter asked. Eli looked at his mother. She gave him a small nod. Saturday, Eli said. I'm gonna be 6. 6. Walter said it like it was a remarkable age, an enviable age, the best age there was. 6 is a big one. You know what I was doing when I turned 6? My old man took me out on Marrow Lake. That's the actual lake, the one the town's named for, and he cut a hole in the ice and we caught a pickerel as long as your arm. Coldest I've ever been in my life, best birthday I ever had. He nodded at the case. Which one were you looking at? Eli's eyes went helplessly to the fox. The blue one, Hannah said quickly. But we're not, we were just looking, we're heading out. Thank you though. Walter straightened up with a grunt and a hand on his knee. He looked at her for a second, and he had kind eyes, watery and pale blue and kind, and he said gently, now hold on, don't run off on my account. Then he turned to the counter. Bridget, he said. So he knew her, of course he knew her, everybody knew everybody. I'll take the blue one, the fox. And throw in a dozen of those tarts, the raspberry and, he scanned the case, a half dozen of the chocolate things, whatever you call those. The woman behind the counter, Bridget, had gone a particular color. Walter. And candles, you got birthday candles? Course you do, a box of those. The ones that you can't blow out if you got 'em. Those are the good ones, the ones that come back. A boy should have the kind that come back. He pulled a worn leather wallet out of his back pocket. How's that all come to? Walter, you don't. How's it come to, Bridget? There was no heat in it. But there was a floor in it. A thing underneath the friendliness that did not move. And the woman closed her mouth and started ringing it in. And Hannah watched the total climb on the little screen, toward a number that made her dizzy. You can't do this, Hannah said. I can't let you. Sure you can. Walter didn't even look up from his wallet. It's not for you, it's for him. You can't say no to a kid's birthday, that'd be cruel. He glanced sideways at her then, and the corner of his mouth moved. And anyhow, I bought too much. Now you've got to help me carry it. You've trapped me. I'm an old man and you've trapped me with raspberry tarts. And Eli laughed. It surprised all of them. Eli most of all. A real laugh, a 6-year-old's helpless bark of a laugh, and it cut through the room like a window thrown open. Hannah felt her eyes sting. She turned her face away so the boy wouldn't see, and she found herself looking right at Bridget, who was boxing the fox cake with her cleaned glass hands. And Bridget would not meet her eyes, and Hannah understood in that moment that the woman knew exactly what she'd done. There's a kind of shame that doesn't show up until someone good walks into the room and makes the small ugly thing you did visible by contrast. Bridget's hands were not quite steady on the box. Walter paid. He took the bags and handed the lightest one, the candles, the box of tarts, to Eli, who carried it like it was made of glass. He picked up his tray of coffees with his other hand. Walk you to your truck, he said to Hannah. These knees don't like the ice and you look like you've got better balance than me. Outside the snow had thickened. The streetlights were coming on early the way they did this time of year, that 4:30 blew dark, and the three of them walked down Main toward the Foodland lot with the cake box swinging gently in Walter's grip. Eli walked between them, and a little ahead, holding his bag of candles, narrating the snow. You from here? Walter asked. Born here. We were over on Birch for a while. We're in the apartments on Selkirk now. He nodded. He didn't say anything about the apartments on Selkirk, which were the cheap ones, which everybody in town knew were the cheap ones, and the not saying was its own kindness. Your fella work at the mill? He did. She kept her eyes on Eli's back. He passed. Year ago last fall, there was an accident at the yard. Walter stopped walking. Just for a second. The snow came down on the both of them. Brisson, he said finally. That's me, Walter Brisson. You'd be Whitfield. Hannah, that's Eli. Whitfield. He started walking again, slower now. Your husband, that wasn't Mark Whitfield, was it? Worked the loaders. Hannah turned to look at him. You knew Mark? Knew of him. Knew his dad better. Old Ray Whitfield put a furnace in my shop. Oh, must be 25 years back, and he did it for cost, because I was just starting out and didn't have 2 nickels. Ray Whitfield. Walter shook his head slowly, and the snow fell off the brim of his toque. I'll be damned. That's a good family. I'm sorry about your husband, Hannah. That's a hard road. That's the hardest road there is, what you're walking. And Hannah, who had held it together in the bakery, and in the truck, and at the funeral, and at every parent-teacher night, and every appointment, and every first of the month. Hannah stopped on the snowy sidewalk and put her gloved hand over her mouth and cried. Not loud, Eli was up ahead, but she cried, finally, in front of a stranger who had known her husband's father. Because the thing about carrying a stone in your chest for 14 months is that you forget you're allowed to set it down. And then someone is decent to you for no reason. And the whole weight of it comes loose at once. Walter didn't say anything. He didn't tell her it would be okay, or that Mark was in a better place, or any of the things people said. He just stood there with the cake box and let her cry. And after a minute he reached into his coat and handed her a Tim Hortons napkin, which was the most useful thing anyone had given her in a year. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry, I don't know what." "Don't." He waved it off. "Don't apologize for that. Lord, the things people make themselves apologize for." He looked down the street to where Eli had stopped to wait for them, a small figure under a streetlight in the falling snow, holding a bag of birthday candles. "How are you set, Hannah? I'm going to ask you straight because I'm too old to dance around it. How are you set, really?" And she told him. She didn't mean to, but there is something about a person who asks you straight, and she told him about the settlement that was gone, about the part-time hours at the Ida that didn't cover the rent and the heat both, about how she'd stopped buying anything for herself a long time ago and was now in the territory of stopping buying things for Eli, about the cake she could not afford, which was such a small thing, such a stupid small thing, and which had broken something in her that morning when she did the math. She told him all of it standing in the snow, and he listened the way Mark used to listen, with his whole face, without once trying to fix it before she was done. "Okay," he said when she'd finished. "Okay, here's the thing, and you can say no and I won't push, but you'd be a fool to say no, so think before you do." He shifted the cake box to his other hand. "My nephew runs the IT outfit over in Sault Ste. Marie. Does the computer end for half the businesses north of here, the booking systems, the websites, all that. He's been after me for a year to find him somebody local who can do the phones and the scheduling from home, somebody reliable, somebody who can talk to people without making them want to drive off the road. It's remote. You do it from a kitchen table. It's not a fortune, but it's full-time and it's steady and it's got benefits. And benefits is a word I'm guessing you haven't heard in a while." He pulled a card out of his wallet. Not his card, his nephew's card, which he apparently just carried around, and held it out. "His name's Theo. Tell him his Uncle Walt sent you and you knew Ray Whitfield's boy. He'll find you the time." Hannah looked at the card. It had a little maple leaf on it, and a phone number. And she did not take it right away because taking it felt like believing in something, and she had gotten out of the habit of believing in things. "Why," she said. "Why would you?" Walter looked down the street at Eli for a long moment before he answered. "When Denise was dying," he said. "That's my wife. She went 4 winters ago, cancer. The slow kind. I couldn't work, couldn't leave her, and we burned through what we had the same as you, the same as anybody does, faster than you'd think. And one morning I went to start the truck to drive her to the city for treatment and the truck wouldn't turn over, dead battery, and I just sat there in the cab and I'm not too proud to tell you I broke down a little, same as you just did." He cleared his throat. "And there was a kid, worked the gas station out on the highway, couldn't have been more than 19, and he saw me sitting there. And he came over with the jumper cables and he got me going, and when I went to pay him for the boost he wouldn't take it. He said somebody'd done it for his mum once, that was all. Somebody did it for my mum once." Walter shook his head. "I never even got his name, and I've thought about that boy more times than I can count, because that was the morning, Hannah, that was the morning. I decided the only thing to do with what people give you is give it to somebody else, because you sure can't pay it back. The fella who needs it never has anything to pay you with. That's the whole trick of it. You pay it forward or it stops, right there, with you. And I decided a long time ago it wasn't going to stop with me." He pressed the card into her hand and closed her glove around it. "So you take that," he said, "and you call my nephew, and somewhere down the road you do this for somebody else, and we'll call it square. That's the only payment I'll take. Deal?" Hannah closed her hand around the card. "Deal," she said. Eli's birthday was that Saturday, and it was the best one he'd had since his dad died. And Hannah knew it was the best one because he told her so, at the end of it, when she was tucking him in with cake still on his breath. The fox cake had sat in the middle of their small kitchen table on Selkirk Street, with 6 candles in it. The kind that come back. The kind Walter had insisted on, and Eli had blown them out 4 times before he figured out the trick. And by the 4th time he was laughing so hard he could barely breathe. And Hannah had laughed too, really laughed. And the 2 of them had sat in that little apartment, laughing at a candle that wouldn't stay out, and it was the first time in 14 months that the apartment had felt like a home, and not a place they were waiting out the winter in. Walter had come by too. She'd told him not to, told him he'd done more than enough, and he'd shown up anyway with a wrapped present under his arm. A tackle box, a real one, with a little starter rod. "For the lake, when it's warm enough, I'll take you both out. I owe this town a fishing trip. And he'd sat at their table and eaten 2 pieces of fox cake and told Eli stories about the pickerel in Marrow Lake until the boy fell asleep against his mother's side. Before he left, Walter had looked around the small clean apartment, at the drawings on the fridge and the worn couch and the photo of Mark on the shelf, and he'd said, quiet, just to Hannah at the door, "You're doing all right, you know. I know it doesn't feel like it. But you're doing all right by him. That boy is loved, you can see it on him. That's the whole job, and you're doing it." And then he'd gone out into the snow, an old man with bad knees, and driven home to his empty house, and Hannah had stood at the window and watched his taillights go and understood that he'd needed Eli's birthday as much as Eli had. She called Theo on Monday. By the new year she was working from her kitchen table, 6 hours a day while Eli was at school, and 2 more after he was in bed, answering phones for half the small businesses in Northern Ontario, and she was good at it, because it turned out that being good at it was mostly about being decent to people who called in upset. And she'd had a great deal of recent practice in being decent to people while she herself was falling apart. The benefit started in March. Again. The first time she took Eli to the dentist on a plan instead of putting it off, she sat in the waiting room and had to pretend she had something in her eye. And the bakery. That's the part of it that came back around. The part Walter would have appreciated, because Walter believed the world had a way of settling its accounts if you gave it long enough. Bridget and her husband closed Petit Beurre in the spring. The official reason was the economy, the price of butter, the usual, but everyone in a small town knows the unofficial reason, and the unofficial reason was that Marrow Lake is a place where people remember. Somebody had been in the shop that day in November. The woman buying the baguette, as it turned out, and the story of the cleaned glass and the boy who breathed on it had gone around town the way stories go around a town that size, quietly and completely, until there was a kind of cold spot around the bakery that the big windows and the gold-flecked cakes could not warm up. People didn't make a fuss, they just stopped going. A town has its own slow justice, and it doesn't shout, it just declines to walk through your door. Hannah didn't gloat about it. She wasn't built that way, and anyhow, by spring she had bigger things in her life than Bridget. But she'd be lying if she said she felt nothing the morning she drove past the dark windows with the paper over them, and the sign that said Merci, à bientôt, which nobody believed. She felt the thing you feel when something that hurt you turns out, in the end, not to have had the power it thought it had. The space sat empty for a while, and then, the following winter. And this is the part that Hannah herself could hardly believe when it happened. A notice went up that it was reopening. A new place. A community bakery, run out of the same building, where the prices were posted plain, and there was a sign in the window that anybody at all, was welcome to come in out of the cold and sit, whether they bought something or not, and where on the bulletin board by the door there was an envelope, and the envelope had a few dollars in it, and a card that said, "If you can spare it, leave it, if you need it, take it. Happy birthday to somebody." She did not run the place. She wanted to be clear about that whenever she told it, because people always assumed she ran it, and she didn't. A young couple ran it, the woman a baker, the man a teacher, good people, the kind of people the town deserved. But Hannah had been the one to suggest the envelope. And Hannah was the one who on the first of every month, when she paid her own bills and found, for the first time in years, that there was a little left over, drove down to Main Street and tucked a few folded bills into that envelope on the board by the door. For some mother she would never meet. Some father counting coins in a cold truck. Some kid pressing his nose to the glass on the morning of a birthday his family couldn't quite reach. Walter was with her, the first time she did it. He was older by then, slower, the knees worse, but he still came round in the mornings with his coffees, and he still wouldn't let an empty house win. He stood by the door while she put the money in the envelope, and he watched her do it, and he didn't say anything, because he didn't need to. He just looked at her with those pale blue watery eyes, and he gave a small nod, the same nod he'd given her on the snowy sidewalk the day they met, and Hannah understood that this was the only thanks he had ever wanted, the only payment he would ever take. To stand there in a warm doorway and watch the thing he'd handed her get handed on, so that it wouldn't stop, so that it would never stop, so that somewhere down the line a frightened person with not enough money and a child who deserved better would walk into a place out of the cold and find, against all their expectation, that the world had left something there for them. There, Walter said, now we're square. He was wrong, of course. They were never square, and they both knew it, and that was exactly the point. That the debt of a kindness can't be settled, only moved along, passed from cold hand to cold hand down a chain of strangers, each of them sure they were the only ones who'd ever been low enough to need it. But Hannah let him have it. She put her arm through the old man's arm, and the two of them stood in the doorway of the little bakery on Main, in the falling snow, on the morning of nobody's birthday and everybody's, and watched the envelope on the board, and waited, the way you wait for the ice to come in, for whoever it was that needed it next. I keep coming back to the $4.35. Such a small number, almost nothing. And yet it was the whole hinge the story turned on. Because here's what I've learned watching people like Hannah Whitfield go through the worst of it. The size of what breaks you is almost never the size of what it costs. It wasn't the money that nearly finished her in that bakery. It was being made to feel like she didn't belong in a warm room. And it wasn't a fortune that saved her either. It was an old man with a tray of coffees deciding she did. What strikes me most is that none of it was luck. We like to call these things luck because that lets us off the hook, but if you look close, every turn had a cause. Bridget was cold to a woman who couldn't fight back, and a town that remembers quietly closed its doors on her, one neighbor at a time. Walter was decent because somebody had once been decent to him on the worst morning of his life, and he'd decided long ago not to let that chain stop with him. And Hannah got back on her feet because she'd already done the hardest thing a person can do, which is keep getting up, 14 months running, for a boy named Eli, who was watching her face to learn how to live in the world. That's the part I want anybody listening to take with them. The kindness gets all the attention, and it should, but kindness alone didn't rebuild that little apartment on Selkirk Street. It took 3 things working together, and they're 3 things you can actually grow in yourself, starting today. The first is just being a decent person when no one's making you, the way Walter was, the way Hannah was even while she was breaking. The second is having the good sense to know when to swallow your pride and take the card someone hands you, and the good sense to pass it on later instead of keeping score. That's not weakness, that's wisdom, and it's rarer than people think. And the third is plain grit. The stubborn refusal to lie down. Hannah called Theo on Monday. She sat at a kitchen table 6 hours a day. She showed up. I don't believe the world owes anyone a happy ending, but I do believe it keeps a kind of ledger. And that ledger has a long memory. Be the person who puts something in the envelope on the board, even when you've barely got it to spare. Be the one who notices the kid pressing his nose to the glass, because someday it'll be you in the cold truck, counting coins, and the only thing standing between you and the dark will be all the small good things other people chose to do before you ever needed them.